Good morning, everyone tuning in from here in the US, and good afternoon to our friends on the other side of the pond in Europe. My name is Rachel Rizzo. I'm a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this very special public event, this super topical public event. How should Europe step up for Ukraine? We today want to discuss the future of US and European policy on Ukraine. February 24th marked the third year of Ukraine's fight for survival against Russia's invasion. During that time, Ukraine has withstood Russia's onslaught with the support of its allies around the world, namely the United States and Europe. But recent moves and rhetoric from the current US President Donald Trump and his administration regarding the future of the conflict have really called into question the future of US support for Ukraine. Meanwhile, Europe, whose countries are the largest net contributors to the support for Ukraine, is also facing calls to increase its support and really lead and step up on providing Ukraine the security guarantees it needs long term for a durable peace. We have a fantastic panel joining us to talk about these issues today. We have Mr. Ian Brzezinski, who is a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council. We have Ms. Leonie Allard, who is a visiting fellow with the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council. We have Dr. Justina Budgenete-Fröhli, who is a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, as well as with the Transatlantic Security Initiative at the Scowcroft Center. And Mr. Aaron Koreva, who is the director of our Warsaw office with the Europe Center here at the Atlantic Council. So we have great representation from all around AC, and I thank all of you for joining us today. And I want to hop right into the discussion. We only have an hour. For those of you watching, we really want to get into audience questions as well for the last little bit of this conversation. So if you're tuning in and have a question, please submit it to askac.org. I have access to that over here on my side, and I can see these coming in, and I'll go ahead and pose them to the panel. So with that, I want to hop right into the conversation, starting with Ian. You and Leonie, about a week ago, wrote a piece on Europe stepping up to the plate for Ukraine, how it should do this, what it should look like. I feel like we live 1,000 lives every day just based on what comes out in the news, what comes out of the White House, what comes out of various European statements and comments. We had High Representative Kaja Kallas here in Washington yesterday. So a lot going on. Can you give us just an overview about how you see Europe's role in the current state of play in Ukraine, how you think it should be stepping up to the plate, and where you see these potential talks going?
Thanks, Rachel. Well, Leonie and I wrote a piece, as you said, about a week ago, and the objective was really to kind of communicate to the Europeans on what they need to do, not only for Ukraine, but also to shape the debate and the decisions that the Trump administration will make regarding Ukraine, to shape its negotiating posture with Russia, so to speak. And we basically kind of had 4 points that they needed to kind of recognize, and then the recommendation. And in short, those 4 points are: one, stating the obvious, much is at stake in this war. Russian victory would be an outcome that would increase the risk of wider war in Europe and would likely embolden the ambitions of other hegemons around the world. To think of China. And it would weaken the transatlantic relationship and the credibility of NATO. Second, we pointed out that Ukraine is being worn down by Russia's onslaught. We don't have endless time. And then more importantly, Putin has yet to be convinced that the West really has the commitment to defeat his aggression. And he's on a track to continue this full-scale invasion as long as it takes, to use that phrase. So we need to convince him otherwise. Third, Trump sees the invasion of Ukraine primarily as a European concern, not a transatlantic or a U.S. concern. And he's not going to do anything more than what the Europeans do. That's why the Europeans need to step up. And then finally, the window to influence the Trump administration is narrowing. This is not the Biden administration, which will have reviews and thoughtful analysis and ultimately incremental outcomes. This is an administration that moves on kind of gut instinct, maybe not so much thoughtful, but always looking for decisive outcomes. And that administration is going to do one of three things. It's either going to impose on its own an unfair, unstable, unjust peace, as it kind of was outlined by President Trump and his team during the campaign. Or two, because this is a European concern in his view, Trump will just walk away from this, saying this is a bad investment for his time and resources. And I'll go out on a limb here, but there is a possibility, a third option, where he would actually take decisive action, the anti-Biden approach, to support Ukraine decisively. So Europe's got to try and push the administration into that third option. That's what I think Macron, Starner, and others are doing. So what do the Europeans need to do? They need to put a bargain on the table. They need to come and say, we are really determined. They need to prove to the Trump administration they're determined to defeat this invasion. And they want to change the correlation of forces, so to speak, on the ground that Putin says. So they're going to be ready. They should say, we're ready to ramp up security assistance to Ukraine. We're ready to really impose truly damaging sanctions on the Russian economy, body slam that economy, and we're ready to stand up with a deterrent force. And that deterrent force, and what we wrote, should be about 2 to 3 divisions. But importantly, it would have an American dimension, but an American dimension would only be about 10% of that force. Think about a headquarters element, some aircraft that could be deployed from Poland or outside Ukraine, some in-country missile defense, some in-country long-range fires. But the preponderance of the force would be European. That's a deal that I think Trump could accept. And I'll put it this way: if they don't make the offer, we're not going to get from the Trump administration that third option, that decisive outcome. We'll get, unfortunately, one of the first two options, and that would be a loss for the transatlantic community. So there's a lot on Europe's shoulders right now.
I mean, do you think that Europe has the wherewithal to really step up to the plate like this without being pushed by the United States?
Europe has the capability. There's no doubt of that. Whether it has the wherewithal remains to be seen. But what is interesting is that we're seeing a change in the perspective of the Europeans. 18 months ago, people were being laughed at if they even thought about or proposed a deterrent force. More or less, the Europeans leading that effort. Now we have the French and the UK coming to Washington, making a proposal for some sort of military presence in Ukraine. That's a radical change over the last 18 months. So for me, that's a movement in the right direction. Whether the Europeans will put on a package on the table that's decisive enough to convince Trump to be part of the solution has yet to be seen. But if you don't act, if you don't ask, you won't get that outcome. That's the message
Yeah.
to Europeans.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. And Leonie, I want to turn to you because, you've written a lot on these issues as well, saying that a coalition of the resolute of European countries should step up and provide these security guarantees for Ukraine. It might not include every European country, but maybe it doesn't need to. Maybe it just needs to include those who are willing to step up. But this week, Emmanuel Macron, president of France, came to Washington, D.C., met one-on-one with Trump, did a press conference. And from my point of view, it seemed like the press conference went pretty well. There was one moment where I think Trump made a comment about how much the Europeans had been supporting Ukraine in terms of money. And Macron kind of put his hand on Trump and said, wait a minute, actually, this is the real number, and interrupted him and corrected him. And which I think is good, because there's this narrative going on that's been going on for a long time that the Europeans aren't doing anything. Macron has also been really forward leaning on this idea of physical European troop presence. At the beginning, when he pitched this idea, he was sort of laughed out of the room. People thought it was really too bold, almost crazy. So where do you see this debate developing? And is it real, I guess?
All right. Thank you so much for, going to this topic. I think I want to start by addressing the visit and then how we arrived here and where we could go next. It really felt like an exchange, and it really felt like finally Europeans were actually, coming out and making an offer. The offer that, as Ian and I have argued, the U.S. administration was waiting for a positive agenda coming from the European to be proposed on their own to the US administration. And Macron has called the meeting a turning point, and I think it's also linked to the fact that they were able to propose something as Europeans to the US, including on the issue of security guarantees. In general, the visit really showcased good relations between the two leaders. I think really a friendly tone, as you mentioned. Macron said, "Wait a minute, I have something to say about this," and I think this is also a testament of the fact that they have a. I think Macron referred to a friendship over the years, and in general, he was received with. Pomp and circumstance. All of the closest advisors of Trump were there at the meeting. So again, this proposal from a European perspective that was delivered by Macron seemed like it was part of a real exchange between the two administrations. And this proposal not only explicitly outlined the fact that Europeans were willing to step up, but how and where and under what circumstances it would be possible for Europeans to accept a just and lasting peace. And he outlined the timing and the process that Europeans would favor, and that France would favor, and that would be first arrive to a ceasefire and there, really being positive about the steps that are being taken by the administration. And then if this ceasefire results in, it works and results in some form of confidence, if the Russians do not violate it, then go to negotiations, include Ukrainians and others to these negotiations, and the limits of these negotiations to be determined by the Ukrainians, and then provide guarantees to make sure that this agreement, this peace is durable, because France, with Germany and others, have the experience of Minsk I and II, which were agreements that were struck to have a ceasefire around Donbass, which didn't include a guarantor force. So it's important as a conclusion to these remarks and to answer your question on the coalition of the resolute, as we called it. It's not a peacekeeping force. It's really a guarantor force coming from the experience we have of striking ceasefire deals with Russia, but also, the aim of this force is to change the Russian calculus. It's really to make sure that the peace is durable, but also make sure that it has an impact on the future moves by Russia, given that Europeans all agree that Russia poses a long-term existential threat in the current setup of security in Europe. So I feel very, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, I really think that the proposal was made. There was an exchange, and after Munich, after MSC, there was a report about a questionnaire that had been given around to European leaders on what this guarantor force could look like. And there have been a set of meetings among Europeans, some organized by Macron, others European Council meetings that really possibly aimed at answering this questionnaire and coming to the US with a proposal.
Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, you see this as bigger. I mean, both you and Ian, in your writing, when we're talking about potential physical presence by Europeans to provide not only long-term security guarantees for Ukraine, but to ensure a ceasefire holds. This is not just a ceasefire force we're talking about. Like, we're talking about something much more substantial. Okay. And we can get back into that, I think, in the conversation, but I do want to turn to Aaron and Justina to kind of give us a frontline states perspective. I mean, Aaron, you are directing our office over in Poland. And, it's interesting. Poland seems to be this, tale of two Europes. It's really forward leaning on defense spending. I think it spends over 4% now, if I have the numbers correct. It's still going up. So it's
Close to 5, yes.
almost 5%. I mean, so this is
Not entirely 5, but close to 5, 4 point.
okay. And
But
this
go
is
ahead.
they've increased it significantly over the last few years. It's still supportive of Ukraine. It's a frontline state, but the Polish government has really been quick to take the possibility of troops in Ukraine off the table. Can you kind of explain to us this dichotomy that we're looking at here? On one side, Poland wants to provide Ukraine with this long-term support. On the other hand, maybe it's not politically popular or politically feasible at this moment for Poland to be taking this position. So kind of give us a breakdown of what you're seeing from Warsaw.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, I must say that I was a little bit surprised when I first heard this sort of categorical no, but I think if one wants to understand this, it's that Poland has been in a perpetual election campaign ever since they had a parliamentary election in October 2023, in which the previous government under Law and Justice Party, PiS, was defeated by the current Prime Minister Donald Tusk and his civic coalition. Now, both sides in Poland are very Poland is a pretty polarized society. There's a lot of very heated debate, but on the topic of Russia and supporting Ukraine, they are fairly united. The main debates is how this support is best to be organized. Now, after that, they had a local election and an EU Parliament election, and now in Poland we are heading into, or we are in, the election campaign for president. President Andrzej Duda has served 2 terms. Like in the United States, a Polish president cannot serve no more than 2 terms. And we're going to have the first round of the presidential election on May 18 and the likely second one on June 1. Why does this matter? Well, simply because the government of Donald Tusk may have a majority in parliament, but they don't have a veto-proof majority. And so President Andrzej Duda, who is from the PiS camp, has been able to block a lot of their legislative initiatives. And so the government's legislative agenda has not been able to move forward, and therefore Prime Minister Donald Tusk is banking a lot on this presidential election. The topic of putting Polish soldiers in Ukraine remains broadly it may be unpopular within society, but of course this is something that could change after the presidential. There's also Tusk has raised the matter of that this could be sensitive in Ukraine itself, given the history of course, what's the city of Lviv and that whole area around there used to be part of Poland before World War II. The expert community is divided on this. Personally, I don't buy it. I think that, maybe putting Polish troops in Lviv itself may not be a good idea. But of course, that's not what we're talking about here, because Lviv is over in the west. Not that I think that the Polish soldiers would conduct themselves unprofessionally. I don't believe that at all. But Ukraine is a society under high stress, and it could be received badly by, for example, the far right in Ukraine or something like that. There is no strong pro-Russian or anything like that political movement in Poland, but the Polish far right, which their candidate is climbing in the presidential elections, have categorically, ruled out the idea of sending Polish troops to Ukraine. And so I think that what Donald Tusk is doing is just trying not to stir things around, because having the civic coalition candidate win the presidential election is very important to him. My personal view is I think that this is a mistake, simply because you cannot talk about being the main, security guarantor of the NATO eastern flank and not being prepared to contribute to what is, in effect, the most important way of securing Europe right now. Now, again, that being said, it's a matter of how this force is going to be put together, and of course, the role of the Americans, which is crucial, as Ian mentioned. But ruling it out in a head like this, I also think is the wrong kind of message to the Trump administration, because it also reinforces this perception that Europe is, if one of the countries that spends the most on defense is not prepared to do it, then what are we talking about here? The proper way of engaging with the Trump administration, I would think, is rather the sort of yes, but, Mr. President, like, yes, Mr. President, we are, of course, prepared to do our part. However, there is something to be said for the fact that Poland has a border with Russia in the northeast in Kaliningrad. It has Belarus directly to the east, which of course in effect is a Russian satrapy, and has been sending. There have been, the migrants have been pushing across the border. That border is an area of tension, and of course Ukraine directly in the southeast. So it is a frontline state for sure. But I just think that from a communications point of view, it would have been better if the Poles had more said like, yes, we're prepared to do our part. However, we'd like to see how we have certain demands on it and so forth. That's just my personal view on that matter.
But you maybe could potentially see this changing after the presidential election?
I think so. It may potentially change after the presidential election. The opinion of the expert community is divided on this, but again, I think it highly depends on how what exactly are the conditions for such a force and what the role of the United States is. Oh, I can also finally add that there is of course the matter of that there are about 10,000 American troops in Poland, and so it's also a question of that the Poles are keen on having those American troops staying there, so they do not want to rock the boat too much in terms of Polish-U.S. relations.
Okay, that makes sense. Justina, I want to come to you to take us a little bit farther to the northeast, and we can discuss the Baltics a little bit. I mean, look, the Baltics have been on the front line for decades now of Russian aggression, especially hybrid aggression. And they've, like I said about Poland, when I was asking Aaron a question, they've also really stepped up to the plate in terms of their defense spending. They've really led on this front. So, as someone who covers this region, how do you see the conversations in the Baltics developing in terms of, physical presence on the ground in Ukraine? Maybe building off of this idea from Ian and Leonie about a coalition of the resolute or coalition of the willing, as we talk about. Do you see the Baltics being open to that? Or if not, I mean, how else do you see this debate playing out at the moment?
Thank you so much. Yes, indeed. It should be said that generally the Baltics and even maybe the bigger group of the Baltic Nordic countries are quite disillusioned about a quick peace in Ukraine and about security guarantees that are other than NATO membership somehow for Ukraine. And the West indeed has kind of track record on this. Just remember the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, through which Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons just in exchange of security guarantees from Russia, but also from the US. Then the Minsk Accords, as Leonie mentioned, that also didn't work. So we have those facts from history that security guarantees is a difficult thing to form and to enforce. So no quick solutions here. And as I said, the Baltics, the Balts, they are still indeed supporting this solution through NATO membership of Ukraine. A second important point is, I think, coming from the Baltics, is that they say there should be no short-termism in the solution for Ukraine. Ukraine security and defense should be seen as a part of European defense, which means that there should be a coherent strategy of how to contain Russia across the eastern flank, including Ukraine, including the Baltic states, including Poland. And here, as Aaron just mentioned, somehow I see the point of the Polish perspective, saying that we are not really well positioned at the moment to send troops to Ukraine because we are an eastern flank country, and we saw a migrant crisis across the border. We saw some hybrid attempts to kind of interrupt into those countries, and expect more, especially if there is this quick and incredible, not credible peace being kind of forged over Ukraine. So what the Balts are saying, the focus should now be on strengthening Ukraine militarily as much as it's possible before there is any ceasefire. So strengthening militarily, that means sending more military assistance. The Baltics and the Nordics are really good on track in this, like leading actually as percent of their GDPs on military assistance to Ukraine. Then creating long-lasting effects that would kind of positively affect Ukraine's and Europe's security. For example, first thing should be strengthening Ukraine's defense industry. We have to keep in mind that Ukraine is indeed a country who is technically intellectually very capable in this area. According to the many analyses done in this area, the current amounts that the Ukrainian defense industry produces is only 1/3 of their potential. What lacks is finances. Baltic states and Nordic states are stepping in this area. For example, the well-known already Danish model of financing Ukrainian defense industry to produce ammunition in Ukraine directly is really a success story, I would say. And more should come in this area. Then, in addition to that, and in addition to what Leonie said and what Ian said about the coalition of the willing, I think that we can see already something information along those lines. For example, there are multiple capability coalitions which Baltic Nordic countries either lead or co-lead on drones, for example, coming from Latvia, on demining lead coming from Lithuania, on IT solutions to improve those military communications in Ukraine coming from Estonia. So these are now the lines that should be kind of strengthened further, just to create, those positive effects both in Ukraine and in those contributing countries to kind of integrate their militaries and bring positive solutions while creating directly facts on the ground in Ukraine at the moment. Then the Baltic states are indeed stepping up with their arguments that Ukraine should be quickly kind of integrated in those European structures. So, for example, fast-tracking Ukraine's EU membership is a way to go. This is something what can be done, and the Baltic states, for example, Lithuania, they are co-financing and program just to strengthen institutions in Ukraine to put them on this good track to manage accessing the EU until 2030. Again, as you said, defense spending is something which is also being like really put on track in the Baltics. Lithuania and Estonia, and I think Latvia as well, already committed to spending those 5% of GDP on defense. And they are now looking forward to solutions at the EU level, indeed, to kind of relax those spending rules in the EU to allow them to borrow more and to step up their defenses in this area. So maybe one more important thing is frozen assets. I think like Estonia is leading now in this area. They are saying that those Russian assets that are frozen, they should be used to advance Ukrainian defenses at the moment. And of course, this is a solution that has to be kind of come up at the EU level, but they are really saying that we have a huge amount of money. I think it's 200 billion euros of frozen Russian assets that should be put now to strengthen Ukraine, to put it in the best possible position. Yeah.
Thanks. I want to follow up on one thing that you said and maybe ask Ian about it. I mean, we hear a lot of the time people saying that the EU should fast track Ukraine's membership. To me, that seems like an impossibility. So Ian, where do you stand on this? I mean, is this something that we should be pushing, or is this something that's sort of a dead end and we should be making other arguments for Ukraine's future security?
Rachel, I'm all for Ukraine being integrated into Euro-Atlantic institutions as fast as possible. With the EU, I think it's a combination of bureaucratic sclerosis and a still instinctual discomfort with bringing Ukraine fully into its membership that slows this down. On NATO, in my view, Ukraine meets all the conditions, met them a long time ago, and it's just a matter of basically two countries really blocking its aspirations, and unfortunately, is Washington and Berlin. But EU membership isn't going to solve the dilemma we face on the battlefield in Ukraine. NATO membership is going to solve the dilemma we face on the battlefield unless that membership is backed up by Western intervention in this conflict. And by Western intervention, I don't mean going and fighting the Russians, but I mean deploying into Ukraine that kind of deterrent force that would significantly enable the Ukrainians to reposition their forces, to concentrate their forces more effectively against the Russians, to shut down the Russians' ability to destroy Ukraine's infrastructure, and to demonstrate to Russia that the West actually has the will to fight and to fight against this aggression. I don't see this war ending until there is that deterrent force there. Because what Russia will do is will continue just to grind away against the Ukrainians. I'm among those who are awed by the courage, the tenacity, the determination of the Ukrainians to defend their territory and our own interests. But they just face an unavoidable imbalance in terms of resources and personnel compared to the Russians. And Putin's willing to sacrifice a whole lot more to get what he wants in Ukraine. And he'll continue to sandpaper down, grind away the Ukrainians into submission. And that will continue only until the West demonstrates it's really ready and determined to leverage the full weight of its overmatch against the Russians. And I mean with that deterrent force, I mean with real economic sanctions, really body slamming that economy, leveraging our ability to get in the information space and go on the offensive, weaponize the power of truth, and really ramping up our efforts to provide the Ukrainian security assistance. But the Ukrainians cannot fight endlessly on their own. They need that Western presence to enable them to fight more effectively, to concentrate their resources, and to communicate to the Russians that the Russians cannot take Ukraine.
Makes sense. Justina, I want to come back to you and pick up on the German angle a little bit. And then Leonie and Aaron, any strings that you want to pull out of the conversation so far, I'll turn to you and you can do that. We just saw an election in Germany on the 23rd, last Sunday. Win for the CDU. It's looking like we'll see a CDU-led grand coalition with the SPD. Of course, the SPD, led by Olaf Scholz, has been, I think they deserve credit, a lot of credit actually, for the support that they've been able to provide for Ukraine over the last few years. But I know there's also skittishness that remains within Germany about how involved they really want to be here in terms of the future, guaranteeing Ukraine's long-term future security, especially when it comes to conversations about physical presence. Can you give us a little bit of this angle and how you see this debate playing out in Germany? Is there any can we look at a potential EU force here with credibility if Germany's not involved? This is, Europe's biggest economy here.
That's true indeed. So there is kind of new political reality in Germany now with, as you said, CDU and SPD most probably forming a grand big coalition. And this somehow, I think, for Ukraine, this is somehow good news indeed, because CDU and Friedrich Merz has been very vocal on Ukraine and has argued for sending those long-range weapons, for example, Taurus, to Ukraine. So now, of course, is the question whether he will indeed kind of make those things happen that he argued for before while being the opposition leader. And the SPD, it could be that the very popular politician Boris Pistorius, who is now still the defense minister in Germany, he might stay as defense minister in Germany, and that would be quite a good duo for Ukraine and for Eastern Europe, I think, for the Eastern flank countries, as they are like in this in this duo, they could be like really vocal and trying to step up for security and defense. At the same time, in the new German Bundestag, we'll have a bigger amount of those rather critical or even you might say pro-Russian voices with AfD and Die Linke, forming now this minority, which unfortunately can block wishes to transform the Grundgesetz, which is important to kind of increase Germany's military spending or to top up the special fund on defense. So what's going on now in Germany, it's they are trying most probably to get those things done before the new government is in place. Just trying to top up the defense fund to kind of help Germany increase or again bring its military back on track, which is at the moment in quite a dire shape indeed. I think the Kiel Institute on World Economy, they have calculated that in current numbers, current production numbers, and in current terms, it would take like 100 years for Germany to bring its military to that position where it was in 2004. So indeed, this is way too slow and nothing which kind of fits into this bigger picture of Germany being the most important and biggest economy of the EU. So what they need really a reform, a procurement reform. They need like a long-lasting assurance to the defense industry so that they can produce more and that they can equip the Bundeswehr to be able to think of sending troops to Ukraine. So I think indeed that at the moment, unfortunately, Germany is not in a position physically to do a lot in this regard. And then again, just to put them indeed a big credit, especially for me as being a Lithuanian, they are now on a good track of sending a brigade to Lithuania, which is of course also, it fits into this bigger picture of enforcing the whole eastern flank. So in Lithuania, this is of course number one thing, and the politicians and the population and everyone is really happy to see those forces coming just to ensure the security on the eastern flank. Yeah, so indeed, quite a difficult question now for Germany, and I think like Friedrich Merz, it was just before the election, but I think he still sticks to that. He says that any kind of discussions on force deployment are premature at the moment. So this maybe is being said just to buy time, although at the same point, I think nothing can happen overnight in Germany at the moment. And indeed, this will take time to bring Germany back on the strategic level in EU defense and in European defense.
Yeah, it's going to take a long time and a lot of pushing. Leonie, over to you for anything that you want to kind of pull out of this conversation.
Yeah, I just want to react on the timing and sort of the credibility of actually deploying forces, which I feel has been questioned a little bit in this conversation. First of all, most Europeans would agree that NATO membership would be the best way to go, but being realistic in this turning point in transatlantic relations, Europe needs to step up and realize that there's a different timing, as Ian said, with the US administration, that there are new red lines, new ways of negotiating with Russia that need to be taken into consideration. And it's, I think during his visit, Macron has said, we support your negotiation. We're ready to support if this brings lasting peace, and if this comes with opens up new possibilities where, the Ukrainians would be negotiating, where Europe can contribute to security guarantees. So it's very difficult to just disagree with the timing of the U.S. administration, but not try to weigh in on it, and not doing it would actually make Europeans a European voice and an ability to influence the outcome even less, to have even less influence. So we need to take into account this timing. Regarding the security guarantees, we kind of outlined that in the piece. You have a few Europeans who have actually supported the idea. Some, as mentioned by Justina, have different views on timing, but there's a general support. And now is the time to think about how to generate this force and what kind of makeup of this force would be, even if it wouldn't be deployed right now. And there, we argued that 2-3 brigades would be realistic. I mean, if you only think of 2-3 divisions, and if you only think of France, we were able to maintain a force of 5,000 troops in Sahel for almost a decade, and at the same time, we were the second largest contributor to the US-led campaign and in Operation Inherent Resolve in Iraq and Syria. So, there's this ability to generate, I would say, over 5,000 troops at least, and 2-3 plus division would be 30,000 or so. So the UK also has this ability to project abroad and could hopefully provide similar numbers. Nothing's been disclosed yet, but these are sort of what these countries have done in the past. And then if you look at the Baltic Nordics altogether, they represent a very large amount of force generation. They have, the Nordics have an air force that's almost the size taken together of the British Air Force. And, there is a lot that Europeans can put on the table if they are willing to do that. And second of all, and Macron has said this during the visit as well, the idea is not to just have the Europeans. Of course, there is a very important role for the US to have, but we understand that boots on the ground is a non-starter. And so Europeans are proposing something, working on new constraints that the US administration is also imposing on European security. And the idea is to have the US providing not being there physically, but providing critical enablers like intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, early warning, long-range strikes, and those don't necessarily entail a big boots on the ground presence.
Yeah.
Those are already taking place in some ways currently. The idea would be to increase them, and then of course to have a backstop US guarantee, a guarantee of the guarantee, sort of to say, but. And that's also part of what Macron has proposed when he came to DC a few days ago. So it's credible. It's credible, and the timing is really paramount in that things are moving quickly, and
it's credible if the Europeans
using timing as an argument.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, Rachel, if I could just add, Europe's got about 2 million personnel, between 1.5 and 2 million personnel under arms. If they can't put up 60,000 troops in Ukraine today, we've got a real problem. And I'm confident they can do that. It's a matter of political will.
Yeah, I mean,
also the second largest budget.
I fully
budget taken together. If you take the EU,
absolutely. I mean, the economy, European economy, is what, 10-15 times the size of Russia. I mean, what are we talking about here? I just wanted to say that, like, and very quickly, like, I was a little critical of Poland earlier, but that's just because I'm so incredibly impressed with what this country has done, and particularly in the case of the war in Ukraine. I mean, early on, Poland was one of those countries that, for loudest voiced its support for Ukraine and delivered. And in terms of who's paying, I mean, Poles have delivered aid on more than 1% of its GDP. You can compare that to the United States, which is something like 0.3 or something like that. So in terms of who's paying, right? And I'm fully convinced that if all the European countries has done what Poland did in the beginning, particularly considering that the Poles were also pushing the Americans and convincing them that, yes, it is worth supporting Ukraine, this war would have been won already, or wrapped up at least, or we would have been in a much better place. So that, for the record, the Poles are also, they have this interesting situation where the two sides are fighting bitterly at home, but in terms of international affairs, they're fairly united. President Andrzej Duda flew to the U.S. and spoke with Donald Trump using the close personal relations he had with him. Radek Sikorski spoke with Marco Rubio. Radek Sikorski, of course, the foreign minister from the other political side in Poland, but he's a man who can talk to the right in the United States. And then, of course, Donald Tusk, the prime minister, who knows Europe very well and is working that angle. And Europe is fairly fortunate, I would say, that Poland right now is holds the presidency of the European Union, and they've chosen security as the theme of the presidency, which is right on point. And there we're seeing that they're putting up or trying to raise the debate of European financing of the defense industry. Right now, I believe Sikorski mentioned that he favors the notion of a rearmament bank, because that would allow non-European countries like the US, Japan, South Korea to invest. Neutral countries in Europe who are, maybe on the sidelines, they're not forced to, and you can also get around obstacles like countries like Hungary. So I just think that from a communication point of view, if the Poles, who still very strongly voiced their support for Ukraine joining the European Union and NATO, well, if you're talking to the Americans then, and at the same time we're not committing troops, well, then the way that particularly the Trump administration is picking this up might be, well, that means you want us to handle that, right? And that it's from a communication point of view, I just think that could have been done better.
Okay.
And let's not also forget, finally, Poland's role as the hub of the rearmament. Of course, pretty much most of the aid to Ukraine, if not all of it, goes to Rzeszów in Poland. That's yet another added factor.
I was going to get into audience questions, and Danuta Hubner asked one, and I think this answers hers. So I won't ask it because I think that you tackled pretty well the role of Poland playing. But Ian, I want to come to you on an audience question from someone named Plamen Pantev, who's in Sofia at the Institute for Security and International Studies. And this is a fun one for you, because I know you have a lot to say about it. What is right and what is wrong with the present structure of Ukraine-Russia negotiations as shaped by Trump's administration right now? And you're muted, so before you start getting into it, you have to make sure we can hear you, because you'll have.
I think I'm back on now. I was trying to avoid the sirens in the background.
Oh, okay.
I don't have a problem with Trump talking to our adversaries. Communication is an important way to resolve disputes and to avoid unnecessary conflict and escalation. But it's really important how you set the context of those discussions and what you say in those discussions. And here's why I get worried about the Trump administration. First, I fear he's kind of trivializing this war. I don't like the phrase looking for a deal. He's repeatedly called for a deal. His cabinet's called for a deal. They call him a great deal maker. Well, we're dealing with a war that's caused over 500,000 Ukrainian battlefield casualties, countless civilian deaths, displacement of millions, Russian atrocities, including summer executions, torture, rape, kidnapping of 10,000s of children. We shouldn't be trivializing this as some kind of deal. And when we trivialize it, we actually communicate to Putin we don't care that much. So second, I feel that our approach has been, well, one that doesn't really kind of even adhere to Trump's own doctrine of maximum pressure. By begging for a deal or looking for negotiations, we're communicating that we're more desperate than the Ukrainians, that's the United States. Maybe we're certainly more desperate than Putin for an end to this war, regardless of the of the terms. And that just Putin's determination, hardens Putin's determination to drive on. And that's basically what we're seeing. Is Lavrov just yesterday dismissed the idea of European forces in Ukraine, and even dismissed the idea of establishing a line of confrontation along the current line of confrontation. So our approach, I think, is a little bit mistaken. And that's why I've been emphasizing that we need to get into a modality that kind of will really register with Putin. You know, he's this old Soviet KGB colonel. He's all about the correlation of forces. Let's leverage our overmatching capability to change that correlation of forces in his eyes and have Putin come to the table begging for negotiations. We have the capacity. We should be exercising that capacity.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty frustrating because this question of did Russia invade Ukraine has kind of turned into the like, did Biden win the 2020 election question? You know, I was watching this video of Tammy Duckworth in I think it was Steve Feinberg, who is up for DoD Deputy Defense
Secretary of
Secretary.
Defense.
She asked him this question, did Russia invade Ukraine? And he wouldn't say yes. I mean, it's a very, I don't know. I mean, this seems like not a great place for the U.S. to put itself. And I mean, this should be such a clear answer, but it's become so politicized.
Well, it's not so much politicized, it's the way the Trump administration is going at it. I mean, the language is using is refusal to assert the fact, which is Russia initiated this aggression. Basically communicates willing to capitulate to Putin's terms, or worse, aligning ourselves with Putin, which all makes Putin dig in harder and drive on further. And worse, I wish Trump would recognize that he looks weak when he's doing this. He's undercutting his own credibility, not just the credibility of the United States, but his own credibility and the credibility of his national security policy of peace through strength.
Yeah, okay. I want to hop to another question from the audience. And for folks that are watching, again, just go to askac.org, type your questions in, and I can get to them. Maybe Justina, this could be for you, but anyone else who wants to hop in on this, please feel free, because it's a super interesting question. It's from someone named Anonymous. There have been a lot of talks about if and how the frozen Russian assets should be used for supporting the reconstruction of Ukraine. I know, Justina, you kind of jumped into this a little bit. This is dividing the EU. How do you assess the possibility of actually using these, and could this potentially affect Trump's positioning? So maybe I'll come to you, Justina, and then if anyone else wants to hop in on that, feel free.
Yeah, so this is an ongoing discussion. There have already been some steps made in this direction. So like the windfall profits of those assets are being used already. So I think Ukraine already received like just over $1 billion or euros paid for its needs from those windfall profits that have been generated from the frozen Russian assets. And then, of course, the discussion is whether the EU should make the second step and to use those assets, which, as I mentioned, is a huge amount. It's around 200 billion euros. Just to use it for Ukraine's needs. And indeed, the opinions are quite differing on this issue. Some kind of are afraid of legal issues with that and saying that this should kind of create a bad precedent of using kind of investment money for in such a way. What the Baltics are saying that this should be actually the way to go because we clearly know who started this war, who is responsible for all the destruction being done in Ukraine. So the aggressor that made this decision to invade an independent country has to pay. And this is the first step actually to make it pay, because this is already in our hands. So we could actually just proactively use this money for Ukraine. Yeah, so this remains a discussion. As we all know, next week there is a high-level meeting of the European Council of the EU member states. So one could expect that this topic will pop up again to the top of the agenda, maybe just to exchange the views and maybe make some resolute decisions in this direction. But this is definitely, if the EU has some money ready to be used, so this is the money actually that potentially could be used for the sake of Ukraine at the moment.
Okay, thanks. Does anyone else want to hop in on that specific question, or I can move on to some others? Okay, so we have about 4 minutes left, and I think that's good because it will allow us for Ian and Leonie and Aaron to give us some final thoughts. I mean, I have a ton of questions, but maybe you can kind of take this in whichever direction you feel like. I mean, a lot of conversations are being had about whether or not and how the EU can step up here as an institution, maybe cooperation between the EU and NATO, even if NATO membership is not on the table. So maybe touch on that, but then any just like final thoughts that you'd really like to drive home for the folks watching, especially, potentially policymakers in Europe that might be tuning into this. So, Leonie, I'll come to you, Aaron, and then Ian, I'll close with you.
Sure. I think this is finally the reckoning moment for strategic autonomy. And, Macron's made this speech, I think, this year that Europe could die if it didn't pursue stronger ambitions in defense, economic, and industrial independence. And now it's the reality check. And of course, it's the future of transatlantic relations will be defined by what happens next on Ukraine and European security, but also on our ability to continue to form an economic bloc. And there the EU has a tremendous amount of leverage to maintain a good relationship with the US, especially in the face of threats of tariffs, etc. I just want to say, in the background of all this, there is domestic politics in Europe, and this is also where the transatlantic relation is shifting. There's a feeling like the US administration wants to connect with different values and change the way the transatlantic relations values and interest centers are. And those creates new link with far-right parties, with and really a vision that is very difficult to grapple with for current elected democracies. So there's been this, and this is why strategic autonomy is so important, and we need to be able to generate more leverage as Europe, as one of the largest bloc of democracy and market, and one of the largest markets in the world.
Let's see. I think Leonie might have frozen there a little bit. So got those great points. Strategic autonomy. Yes. We can't hear you, Leonie, so you might still be talking. So I'm going to turn it to Aaron. And then
coming back to domestic politics, this idea that we're going to have to make a lot of...
Leonie, I think you're cutting out, so I'm going to mute you and go ahead and turn to Aaron.
Okay. This is the most important conflict in Europe by far since 1945. I mean, if anyone doesn't realize that at this point, they've been asleep. If we get this right, we would have prevented a major, like an even bigger war in Europe, and we will secure the peace for a long time. If we get this wrong, we are, stepping very quickly into something that can be way, way worse than what it is now. We've seen this movie before, and it's not pretty. It may not, the history may not repeat itself. It sure does rhyme. I don't like the rhyming particularly either. I fully agree with this notion that we can't trivialize this. And I mean, I know we're bumping up towards the end. So, I mean, I don't know from where this idea in the United States administration comes from that in order to do diplomacy, you sort of have to suck up to the other side or repeat his propaganda. This is simply incorrect. And I'm sure that there are plenty of people in the United States who understand that. And if the administration doesn't, then the Europeans are just going to have to remind them.
Ian, final thoughts.
Thanks, Rachel. You know, the topic was how Europe should step up for Ukraine. And the way I would put it is now is the hour. And if Europe stands up for Ukraine, leveraging its capacities, its overmatch over Russia, through economic leverage, information campaigns, through a robust deterrent posture or deterrent force in Ukraine, it will not only be saving Ukraine, it'll be saving Europe, and it'll be saving the transatlantic relationship. Because the most effective way to get the United States and the Trump administration engaged in that effort is to demonstrate European determination and commitment to doing what is necessary to enable Ukraine to defeat this invasion and reestablish, military stability to Europe's eastern frontier. Waiting for the United States to lead on this is not going to get the results it did in the past. But Europe can catalyze that American commitment. So it's Europe's hour.
I think that's a great message to end on. Ian, thank you so much. Leonie, Aaron, Justina, thank you for taking time out of your schedules to join us today. I think we walked away with a lot of really substantive recommendations for Europe, and hopefully the folks watching there that have ins with policymakers can take some of these and we can see some movement. So to everyone tuning in, thank you, of course, and continue to tune into the Atlantic Council Europe Center, Scowcroft Center, Transatlantic Security Initiative for more events and written products on exactly this topic. Eurasia Center, of course, also. So thanks to everyone, and we'll see you again soon.